This is Johnny DevCraft, and I want to talk a little bit about some ViewModel validation today with Fluent Validation. So I've titled this, of course, ViewModel Validation with Fluent Validation, creating an environment for clean POCOs to flourish. Now, a couple problems that I'm trying to solve with this video is, number one, I want to remove logic from my POCOs. And if you don't know what a POCO is, that's a plain old C object. And a plain old C object should be just that. It should have properties, fields, that's it. No logic at all should exist in a POCO. And we also want to make our validation testable without having to test into other frameworks. So we want to create unit tests for our validation, not integration tests. So these are the two problems that we're trying to solve. And I know that we have data annotations out there, and I hear it said all the time, well, if you're just decorating some data annotations so that you can use the built-in validation mechanisms for ASP.NET Core, then that's not so bad. Your POCOs are still mostly POCOs, but unfortunately for me, I'm very OCD, and mostly POCOs is not good enough. So I needed a way to really just have my POCOs be just POCOs, and that means not decorating them. I mean, after all, they're not Christmas trees. Anyhow, keeping that in mind, we wanted to be able to remove logic from the POCOs and make validation testable. Now, I've played with this over the years and built some frameworks for doing this, but I really like this framework that I'm about to show you because it has all the things that I was trying to create, and it's a little bit better thought out. And so I have to give props where props are due. And so the team from Fluent Validation that put this together, or the guy, whoever put it together, great job. Well done. So there's two NuGet packages that you need to know about for Fluent Validation. The first one is just Fluent Validation, and the second one is FluentValidation.asp.NET Core, or ASP.NET Core. There's two different ones because when you're working with Fluent Validation, I'm going to show it in the context of an ASP.NET Core application, but you can use it really anywhere. You can use it in WinForms, you can use it in the older MVC frameworks, you can use it in Xamarin, and there's all sorts of different packages, but we're talking about in the context of ASP.NET Core today, and I really practice layered architecture where I like to separate my different layers into different projects. So I'll typically have a data layer, and on top of the data layer, I'll have a logic layer, and on top of that, I'll have a presentation layer. And I usually have a domain that's separate from that has all my domain objects in it. So I may not have my validation in the presentation layer. My validation may actually exist outside of that presentation layer because I really like my presentation layer to be as dumb as possible. I really like it to focus on one thing and one thing only, and that's presenting. So there's two packages. The first one contains just what you need to get validation up and running using Fluent Validation. Now, if you're using it in ASP.NET Core, at some point you will need the Fluent Validation.ASP.NET Core package, because this is what allows you to integrate with the inversion of control container that's in place for .NET Core, MVC, ASP.NET Core applications. So that's the Microsoft Dependency Injection package that I'm talking about. So if you want to be able to directly tie into that and add services and have that be simplified, then you will need the Fluent Validation.ASP.NET Core package. However, if your validators are in a separate project, like I mentioned before, if they're in a domain project or in some other project, you wouldn't want to bring in all of the ASP.NET Core packages required for Fluent Validation.ASP.NET Core. So when you're building those validators there, you'd only want to reference that Fluent Validation package. But you'll still need to add the ASP.NET Core package to your actual API application as well. And you'll see that as we start to go through some of the code here. So installing that using .NET is pretty simple. You got to be in the folder for your project, or you have to tell it which project to install into, but it's just .NET add package. And you know, I've got the two here. It's Fluent Validation and then Fluent Validation ASP.NET Core. At the time of me creating this video, we are version 8.1.1. So this is still continuing to be developed. It's a great package. I love it. I use it. I recommend it. So in our startup.cs of our web API application, we need to add Fluent validations to the add MVC command. So right here you can see this services.add MVC, and then we add Fluent validation. That's actually what gets it going and ties it into the MVC pipeline so that you can take advantage of model state validation inside of your controllers, which we'll take a look at that in a few minutes. And then the other important part here is you need to add your validators. So the validators are some classes that we'll talk about creating in a few minutes, but you do need to add them here as an iValidator of whatever type you're validating. And so you can see I've done that, and I'm also adding them as a transient resource. And that just means that every time a class needs this validator, it will create the validator, apply it to the class, and then when the class goes away, so does the validator. You could probably do it as a singleton as well. I just did it as a transient here. I really don't think there would be much of a difference because there's not a lot of logic that has to be recreated over and over for it to work properly. So here I have a simple POCO. This is a create task request POCO. And this is a view model, and validation typically you're going to do it on view models. We're not going to validate our entities so much. We're going to validate the data coming into the system as a view model. So we have a basic POCO here. I have absolutely no decorations on this at all. It's just a subject, description, start date, end date, and an assigned to. And you can see if you look at this, this is actually in my domain namespace. So I told you I like to do a layered approach to architecture, and so I have a domain project that has view model request task controller, and inside there's a create task request. So when we look at the validator, you'll see that it's actually in the same namespace. So it sits right beside my create task request model. And it inherits from that abstract validator, and then we pass it the type that we're validating, which is a create task request. Now, some things that are important here to keep in mind is that as we're validating this object and using this abstract validator is available inside of Fluent Validation. So I don't need to bring in the ASP.NET Core version of Fluent Validation to get access to this abstract validator. And since this is really the only object we're creating for validation, we don't need all that all those extra packages that come with the ASP.NET Core version of the abstract validator. So here I've created my create task request validator, and in the constructors really where the magic's happening. So I'm creating 4 different rules that are going to validate 4 different properties on my model. And on that subject, you can see that it has to be not null, it has to be not empty, it needs a minimum length, it needs a maximum length. For the date time, it's got to be greater than or equal to today, and for the end date, it's got to be greater than today. And we're also making sure that the assigned to is empty, because we're going to do that at a later point in this test application using the user that you're logged in as. So we don't want you passing that into us. So actually I should probably just remove that field from this particular object, but for the sake of showing some different rules, we've added it here, and it's got to be empty. So we've inherited from the abstract validator class, and that is an abstract class. So you can't just new up a new abstract validator. You actually have to inherit from it in order for you to have a class that can be instantiated. And then we're implementing our logic here in the constructor, and so that's really how a validator goes. There's some other things you can do with this. There's some other overrides that you can do to gain access to some post-validation methods, things like that. And if you want to see those at the end of this presentation, I've got a slide that's dedicated to links, and you can go to the Fluent Validation project page, And they talk about some of those extra things that you can do. But for the purposes of this demonstration and this video, I'm not really going to go too far into that. So when it comes to using that model in the request, you can see I've got this post request right here that's an HTTP post method. And we're taking in a create task request from the body, and that's our model. And the very first line inside of that is checking to see if the model state is valid. Now, if you've been using MVC for a while, you've probably seen code like this because validation using the data annotations has been built into MVC for quite some time now. What we're doing that's different here is way back on our startup when we added Fluent validation to MVC, we were changing the validation mechanism that the model state is using. So now when we call that model state.isValid, it's looking at the model that we're passing in, which is that create task request. It's going back to the dependency injection chain, and it's looking for the validator that's used to validate that type of model, and then it's running the validation on it. And if that validation comes back that it's not valid, we're just returning a bad request right off the bat with the model state included. That model state includes all the errors, the properties that were errored, so that we can then take in the UI and really show, hey, you know, your subject wasn't long enough, or your subject was empty, or all these different things that you can do with it. We actually don't run any other logic until we validated that that model state is valid. And once again, we're just using Fluent validations to do that. So now that we've got our Fluent validations and we've got that separated and it's not part of our POCO anymore, it makes it really easy to jump in and test our code. So here you can see I'm using Microsoft Test. Please no booing. I know a lot of people have mixed feelings here, but this is one that I see used in a lot of corporations, so I wanted to show it here. You can do the same thing with XUnit, InUnit, whatever testing framework you want, this works the same. But basically, you can see I'm getting a validator where I create a new task request validator. I'm also creating a new task request to validate. You can see that the subject is empty, and if we go back to the validation from before, you remember that the subject can't be empty, that it has to have a minimum of 5 characters. So, you know, down at the bottom, we're asserting that there are some errors that are going to be coming back from this validation, and that one of those errors is that subject must not be empty. So I'm going to pop real quick over to the code. We'll take a look at that. And here's my code. We'll look at the test, and we're going to run this test. This is the exact same code that I was showing you just a second ago in the presentation. It'll take it just a second to run, and we'll see that test is pending. And we'll see that it's a success, that because that subject was empty, it definitely wasn't valid. And not only do we have this validation here that showed wrong, I'm going to go ahead and put a breakpoint right here, and we'll take a look at what this result object looks like. So now we'll run this, and we'll run it with debug. And I'm using Writer on a Mac. So if you're wondering what my IDE is, it's Writer. I really love JetBrains. They have some great tools, especially if you're working on a Mac. But now we can see that as I'm stopping here, we've got a result object, and if I dig into that result object, it's got 2 errors. And we can dig into those errors, and we can see that one of those is the subject must not be empty, and the length of the subject has to be at least 5 characters. So as we come in here, we can see the property name right here. We can see the property name on this one as well, which is right here. And it tells us what the error is. This allows us to really do some good mapping back in our front end to say, hey, these are the errors that you have right now with what you've put together. So this is what actually gets returned in our model state as well when we send that model state back. So you know, our tests are succeeding. I haven't written a lot of tests. We only have 1 test here, but the test is succeeding. It is doing the validation, and the validation is coming back as not valid. So that's working as expected. So now we have testable validation code that we can easily run inside of our controller and easily produce the results that we're looking for. And it's all completely segregated. I don't have POCOs that have logic in them anymore, which if you're OCD like me, it helps me sleep better at night, okay? I honestly lose sleep when my POCOs have logic. It bothers me. So I promised you some helpful links. Here they are. You can check out my blog post about this right there. It's on medium.com. You can also check out the code base. In fact, this link to the code base includes the branch that has my testing in it. And if you really want to dig in and learn more about Fluent Validation, which I highly recommend, there's a link there at the bottom that takes you to the Fluent Validation project page. This has been Johnny DevCraft. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Comment below, leave some feedback for me, and look forward to doing future presentations for you. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.